A United States Army general stood at the front of a briefing room in Quang Ngai Province in late 1966, studying a map of contested territory that his own intelligence officers had told him was unmanageable. And he looked across the table at the commanders of a foreign allied unit that had just arrived in his region. He looked at their uniforms. He looked at their equipment. He looked at their faces. And then he said something that the officer sitting across from him would remember for the rest of their lives, and which would ricochet back at him from the walls of history with a velocity he could not have anticipated. He told them, in language polite enough for a briefing room and dismissive enough to draw blood, that he did not believe their men were capable of holding the ground they had been assigned, that the terrain was too rugged, the enemy too experienced, the force structure too small. He did not say it quite so plainly, but the meaning was clear to every officer in that room, including the Korean ones. These men are not soldiers, not real soldiers, not the kind of soldier this war requires. Wait, what? A general of the United States Army, in the middle of a war his own service was struggling to win, just told the commanders of the Republic of Korea Marine Corps Blue Dragon Brigade that he didn't think their men could cut it. The same Korean Marines who had sailed into Cam Ranh Bay the previous year with a commander who told reporters on the dock that his men had only one purpose in Vietnam: combat? The same men whose arrival had been documented with a kind of polite institutional skepticism that barely concealed the assumption that Allied Asian troops were something to be managed rather than feared. Oh, this story gets so much stranger than you think. Because what those Korean Marines were about to do in the hills 12 kilometers north of Quang Ngai City, what they were about to accomplish in 4 hours of close quarters fighting against an enemy force that outnumbered them 8-1, what they were about to prove in the early morning darkness of February 15, 1967, none of it would have happened the way it did if anyone in the American chain of command had bothered to understand who they were actually looking at when they looked at the Blue Dragons. One classified American assessment written after the battle contained a sentence that served simultaneously as a military judgment and an institutional confession. The Koreans were described in language that would have made the dismissive general wince as extraordinarily thorough and effective, the kind of effective that makes commanding officers wish they had been wrong about everything else they'd ever assumed. You are about to discover why a single company of Republic of Korea Marines, 294 men inside an oval perimeter on a low hill in Quang Ngai Province, chose to use themselves as bait. Why the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army, despite capturing documents that explicitly warned their own forces to avoid contact with Korean units unless victory was 100% certain, launched a regimental-sized assault anyway. And why, when the smoke cleared before sunrise on that February morning, the ground inside and around that Korean perimeter told a story that changed the way every American general in Vietnam thought about what an Allied force could actually do. Stay with me. The thing about the Republic of Korea Marine Corps that every American senior officer in Vietnam got wrong, from the intelligence analysts in Saigon to the division commanders who processed Korean units into their areas of operation, was rooted in a kind of institutional arrogance so deeply embedded it had become invisible. Americans in Vietnam were fighting the largest military commitment their country had made since the Second World War. They were operating 500,000 strong. They controlled the airspace, the logistics chain, the strategic communications architecture, and the chain of command that nominally encompassed every Allied unit in country. When you are the largest, loudest, best-equipped military force on the battlefield, there is a gravitational pull toward the assumption that size equals capability, that American equals most capable, that everyone else is, by some degree of measurement, less. The Korean Marines arriving in October 1965 looked different from American expectations in ways that American officers catalogued without really understanding. They were smaller in stature than American troops on average. Their equipment was older. In the early period of their deployment, they were still carrying M1 Garand rifles, a weapon the American military had replaced a decade earlier. They communicated in a language that American liaison officers could not follow. Their training methods were opaque to external observation. Their physical standards were intense in ways that could be seen but not easily measured, and their command culture bore the marks of a military tradition that Americans had never been required to learn. So the Americans observed the surface and missed the substance. They saw the size and the equipment. They did not see the memory underneath. Because underneath every Korean Marine who stepped off a ship in Cam Ranh Bay in 1965 was a history that had no American equivalent. South Korea had emerged from the Korean War of 1950 to 1953 with a professional military shaped by catastrophe. More than 36,000 Americans had died in that war, but Korea itself had been devastated in ways that dwarfed those numbers. Civilian and military casualties that reached into the millions, a peninsula burned from end to end, a capital city that had changed hands 4 times, and a population that had watched its homes, its families, and its villages erased by a conflict that lasted 3 years and ended in an armistice, not a peace. The Korean military that came out of that experience was not interested in half measures. It was not interested in comfort or caution. It had been forged by the kind of institutional fire that leaves no room for professional softness, because professional softness, in the Korean military's lived experience, had a body count attached to it. The men who formed the 2nd Marine Brigade, the Blue Dragons, were volunteers from that tradition. When President Park Chung-hee announced the deployment to Vietnam in 1965, and negotiations with Lyndon Johnson concluded with the South Korean government winning significant concessions, combat pay for their soldiers at American expense, military equipment for Korean reserve units back home, guaranteed American force levels in Korea. The men who raised their hands to go were not reluctant conscripts fulfilling a political arrangement. They were professional soldiers in a military culture that glorified the warrior tradition, where physical toughness was not a point of pride, but a baseline expectation. They practiced taekwondo in their morning exercise routines on the docks at Cam Ranh Bay, while American reporters watched and filed stories about their exotic warm-up methods. What the reporters were actually watching was the surface manifestation of a discipline that ran bone deep, a discipline cultivated in a society that had survived annihilation and drawn from that survival a particular kind of professional intensity. The Blue Dragon Brigade under Brigadier General Lee Bong-chul arrived in Vietnam with a clear-eyed understanding of the political architecture surrounding their deployment. Park Chung-hee had negotiated hard to send these men. He had extracted concessions from the most powerful nation on earth from a position of relative weakness, because he understood that his soldiers' presence in Vietnam was worth something real to Washington, and that Washington's desperation for Allied legitimacy, what the Johnson administration called the many flags policy, could be leveraged into benefits that would outlast the war. The Korean soldiers arriving in South Vietnam were therefore not a military convenience. They were an investment. They were also, as it would develop, something nobody had planned for, the most effective Allied ground force in the entire war. But nobody knew that yet, and in the meantime, American officers were writing assessments. The Korean approach to operations in their tactical area of responsibility in Quang Ngai Province was, from the beginning, visibly different from American methods in ways that American observers noted but persistently misread. Korean Marines, before conducting any mission, laid out their plans with a methodical, almost compulsive thoroughness that American officers sometimes characterized as slowness. Where American units tended to favor a single systematic sweep of a village, followed by the removal of civilians for screening elsewhere, Korean Marines subjected a settlement to a series of detailed searches, interrogating subjects on the spot, cross-referencing information in real time, building a picture of a village's social structure before deciding what it meant. They learned Pidgin Vietnamese deliberately because they believed that most formal military translators were at risk of being compromised as enemy informants, and they trusted their own improvised communication over the official channels. They seized weapons from caches in numbers that American intelligence officers found difficult to explain. An official United States government report on Allied participation in Vietnam would later note, in language that conveyed genuine puzzlement, that there was never an American unit in Vietnam that could smell out small arms the way the Koreans did, that they might not generate impressive body counts on a given operation, but they would return from the field with 75 or 100 captured weapons hauled out of positions the enemy had believed were permanently concealed. This weapon seizure rate was not luck. It was the product of intelligence gathering conducted with patience rather than speed. Korean Marines were trained to understand a village as an ecosystem, to read the relationships between people and terrain and time, the way a tracker reads a trail. They had to operate this way, in part, because their force structure gave them no alternative. The Blue Dragon Brigade, at its core, was a brigade-sized unit trying to pacify and control a significant slice of central Vietnamese coastal territory, with a fraction of the manpower the Americans were deploying for comparable or smaller areas of responsibility. They could not afford American-style attrition. They could not carpet an area with troops and rely on mass presence to generate security. They had to be precise. Precision required intelligence. Intelligence required patience. And patience, in the American military culture of 1965 and 1966, looked very much like inactivity. By the time the 2nd Marine Brigade established its operational presence in Quang Ngai Province in September 1966, the Viet Cong local and regional forces in the area had already begun developing a specific professional fear of Korean methods that would eventually show up in their own internal documents. Time magazine reported in 1966 that captured Viet Cong orders stipulated that contact with Korean units was to be avoided at all costs, unless a Viet Cong victory was 100% certain. This was not rhetorical excess. This was operational guidance, passed down through communist military channels by commanders who had watched what happened to Viet Cong units that engaged Korean Marines and concluded that the risk-reward calculation was fundamentally different from engaging Americans. Americans could be bled. Americans could be drawn into ambushes. Americans, despite their firepower, could be made to suffer in ways that would eventually push their political system past its tolerance for casualties. Koreans were something different. Koreans were relentless and methodical in a way that felt, to the enemy, more like a natural phenomenon than a military operation. So the North Vietnamese Army's decision to attack the 11th Company of the 3rd Battalion, Blue Dragon Brigade, on the night of February 14, 1967, was not taken lightly, and it was not taken in ignorance. They knew who they were attacking. The question, from the North Vietnamese perspective, was whether the situation they had carefully constructed gave them the odds they needed. The 11th Company was posted at Tra Binh Dong, in Vietnamese, Tra Binh Dong, a small hill approximately 12 kilometers north of Quang Ngai City. The hill was low, perhaps 30 meters above the surrounding ground, and it was oval in shape with a perimeter of roughly 800 meters. Inside that perimeter, Captain Jong Kyung Jin commanded 294 men, organized around 3 rifle platoons and 1 fire platoon with attached mortar elements. The position was not an accident of deployment. It was a deliberate tactical choice of the kind that Korean Marine doctrine had been refining for months in Quang Ngai Province. The company was positioned to control avenues of enemy movement toward Highway 1 along the coast and toward the provincial capital. It was positioned, in other words, to be in the enemy's way, and positioned to be in the enemy's way meant positioned to be attacked. Captain Jong's men had spent weeks reinforcing their position. The perimeter was layered. Outside the wire, and there were 2 lines of barbed wire, a standard barrier, and a 5-strand concertina arrangement beyond it. The Koreans had buried 140 landmines in the approach corridors most likely to funnel an attacking force. They had positioned 63 Claymore anti-personnel mines. They had reinforced the bunkers with overhead cover capable of withstanding indirect fire. The fire plan was detailed and exercised, with mortar positions pre-registered on the most probable enemy assault lanes and artillery support from the brigade's composite battalion coordinated down to specific grid references. The position had been built by men who expected to be attacked and intended that attack to be the last mistake the attacking force made. They also had a warning. A Viet Cong defector, a man who had served as a training camp commander, came in from the cold in the days before the assault and told Korean intelligence exactly what was coming. The North Vietnamese 40th and 60th Battalions of the 1st Ba Gia Regiment, 2nd Division, reinforced by a local force battalion from Quang Ngai Province, were moving into position. Total attacking strength, depending on the source, between 1,500 and 2,400 men, against 294 Korean Marines on a low hill with 800 meters of perimeter. Captain Jong received this intelligence. He alerted his chain of command. He reinforced his perimeter. He did not request evacuation or withdrawal. The company would hold its position because holding the position was what the position was for. In the Korean Marine doctrine that had been forged in the mountains of their own peninsula and refined in the hills of Quang Ngai, a company tactical base was not a point of vulnerability. It was a point of strength. You built it right, you fortified it right, you positioned your weapons right, and then you invited the enemy to try. The Americans had not quite understood this. The general who had questioned the Koreans' ability to hold their ground had been thinking about what it would take for American units to hold ground, which involved helicopter rapid reinforcement, massive fire support, and the institutional expectation that no unit would be left to fight alone beyond its organic capability. Korean doctrine was different. Korean doctrine said, prepare your ground, trust your men, and let the enemy discover what they have walked into. What the North Vietnamese discovered on the night of February 14th into 15th, 1967, took 4 hours to fully reveal itself, and it cost them a price they had not anticipated paying. The assault began at the wire. It was dark, and the enemy approached through terrain they had reconnoitered and believed they understood. Some of them had disguised themselves as refugees in the days before the attack, passing near the Korean position close enough for Captain Jong's scouts to see them. Close enough that Jong had begun strengthening his security around the perimeter even before the defectors' intelligence arrived. Now those men came out of the darkness in force, and the wire was the first obstacle, and the landmines and the claymores were the second, and the interlocking fields of fire from the Korean bunkers were the third. The perimeter was breached twice. This is the fact that makes the battle remarkable beyond its tactical outcome. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces were skilled enough, determined enough, and numerous enough to actually penetrate the Korean defenses in 2 separate locations. This was not a case of attackers being destroyed cleanly at the wire before ever reaching the defenders. This was a case of attackers getting inside, and of Korean Marines fighting them with bullets until the bullets were gone, and with grenades until the grenades were gone, and then with entrenching tools and pickaxes and fists. Staff Sergeant Bai Jong-chun and his first squad of the 3rd Platoon were at one of the breach points. When the enemy came through the wire at their position, they did not fall back. They held and they fought, and the fighting moved through the progressive stages of desperation that infantry combat produces when it reaches its most fundamental level. When there is no longer a clean line between fire and maneuver, because there are enemies on 3 sides, and the only way out is through. First Squad held. Private First Class Kim Myong-deok was at another position along the perimeter when the enemy surged toward him across ground that the claymores had already swept once. He killed 10 enemy soldiers with his rifle as they advanced toward his position. 10, counted and confirmed in the after-action accounting that followed the battle. He held. Sergeant Lee Ha-kwon took a decision that the men who witnessed it would spend the rest of their lives trying to find words for. With the enemy close enough to touch, Lee picked up 2 grenades, 1 in each hand. He let the enemy come. He waited until they were at the minimum safe distance that would kill them and likely kill him as well, and then he threw himself forward and detonated both grenades simultaneously. The enemy at that point in the line died with him. Lee died too. He was posthumously awarded the Taeguk Medal, the Republic of Korea's highest military honor. Second Lieutenant Shin Won-bae, commanding the 1st Platoon, identified an enemy mortar position that had set up beyond the perimeter and was firing into the Korean position at a rate that was going to kill people faster than the battle otherwise could. He led a fire team, 4 men, going out through the wire in the dark while the perimeter was being assaulted on multiple sides simultaneously, 100 meters beyond the Korean lines, directly toward the mortar crew. He and Staff Sergeant Oh Sung-hwan swept the position, killed the mortar crew with machine gun fire and grenades, and turned around and walked back through the wire to organize the 1st Platoon for a counterattack to restore the perimeter. 2 American Marines were there that night. Lance Corporals Jim Porta and Dave Long, attached to the Korean Company as part of Sub-Unit 1, 1st Air Naval Gunfire Liaison Company, the Anglico team that provided the bridge between Korean ground forces and American air assets. Both men fought. Porta and Long coordinated close air support from American aircraft overhead, directing strikes close enough to the Korean perimeter that the blast pattern overlapped with their own position, killing enemy soldiers at the wire while Korean Marines held the ground inside. Both men were credited with killing enemy infiltrators personally, with joining the counterattack when the perimeter needed restoring, with treating the Korean wounded while the firing was still ongoing. When morning came, they were still alive, and they understood what they had spent the night watching, and they did not have a ready framework for describing it, because nothing in their training or their experience had prepared them for a night like this. The battle ended before sunrise. 4 hours after it began, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces that had attacked the 11th Company broke and withdrew from the position. They left 246 dead on and around the Korean perimeter. More than 100 of those bodies were found inside the wire, inside the Korean position itself, testament to how far the breach had extended before the Korean counterattack closed it. 3 flamethrowers, 5 anti-tank rocket launchers, 2 machine guns, 28 rifles, 100 pieces of demolition explosive, and more than 6,000 rounds of ammunition were captured in the position and the immediate surrounding area. 2 prisoners were taken, one of them a North Vietnamese battalion commander. The 11th Company's dead numbered 15 Korean Marines against 246 confirmed enemy, killed in 4 hours of fighting that reached the level of bare hands. The news reached Quang Ngai Province headquarters, and then Saigon, and then Seoul, and then the rest of the world. The New York Times ran a brief story on February 16, 1967, noting that Koreans had killed 242 in a Vietnam clash. The number was imprecise, but the headline was accurate in the way that headlines sometimes are. It captured the scale of the disparity without capturing anything of its meaning. The battle that would become known in Korean military history as Cha Bin Dong, the Battle of Tra Bin Dong, became the seed of an entire tradition of institutional narrative. In the months following the battle, foreign correspondents covering South Korea's military role in Vietnam coined a phrase that stuck to the Blue Dragon Brigade for the rest of the war: myth-making Marines. The phrase meant it as a compliment, and the brigade accepted it as one, adding it to the lineage of names Korean Marines had accumulated in earlier conflicts: ghost-catching Marines from the Korean War, invincible Marines from the same conflict's amphibious operations. These were not marketing slogans. They were the shorthand a military culture uses to record what its people have proven themselves capable of. President Park Chung-hee ordered every enlisted Korean Marine promoted 1 rank following the battle. It was the first unit-wide promotion the Korean military had issued since the Korean War. The Korean government awarded more decorations for a single action, the Battle of Tra Bin Dong, than for any other engagement of the Vietnam War. Captain Jong Kyung-jin received the Taeguk Medal, the Republic's highest honor. South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu visited the position. American commanders who toured the site in the battle's aftermath did so in a silence that witnesses described as the particular silence of men who are revising what they believed was possible. What happened in the broader war following Tra Bin Dong demonstrated the battle's strategic resonance beyond its immediate tactical result. The North Vietnamese Army's 2nd Division, which had launched the attack through its 1st Ba Gia Regiment, abandoned its plans for subsequent attacks against Quang Ngai City and against the United States Marine Base at Chu Lai. 2 combat objectives, backed by a regiment-sized force, were quietly shelved by enemy commanders who had sent those men into the dark against the 11th Company and received them back in fragments. The calculation that had driven the assault, that a force of 1,500 to 2,400 men attacking a company-sized position could guarantee victory close enough to the 100% threshold that Korean doctrine required before engagement had been wrong. And the North Vietnamese Army, which was not an organization that made the same mistake twice without processing the lesson, processed it. Post-war analysis of captured North Vietnamese Army documents from the broader period of Korean military operations reveals the depth of that processing. Documents from 1966 through the end of Korean involvement carried specific operational guidance about the Blue Dragons and the Capital Division. Avoid contact unless victory is certain. One captured order from a North Vietnamese regiment, dated from a later period in the war, described, with a precision that carries its own kind of respect, the specific tactical problem Korean Marines posed. The Americans, the document noted, could be engaged in terrain where they could be drawn into ambush, could be made to suffer, could be separated from their fire support and destroyed in detail. The Koreans operated differently. They moved without announcing themselves. They established ambush positions and maintained them. They did not sweep an area and leave. They remained, and in remaining, made long-term communist operations in their areas of responsibility functionally impossible. The official United States government assessment of Korean participation in Vietnam, published in the Vietnam Study Series, recorded the institutional conclusion American analysts eventually reached after years of observation. The enemy feared the Koreans both for their tactical innovations and for the soldiers' tenacity. The report noted, in language that preserved the genuine puzzlement of its authors, that it was of more than passing interest that no American unit in Vietnam had ever been able to locate small arms caches the way Korean units did, and that the considered professional opinion was that it was fortunate the Koreans were friendlies. That last phrase carries more institutional weight than it might appear to. It is the assessment not of an ally being evaluated, but of a force being acknowledged as something that could not be fully explained by the frameworks available to the evaluators. The Americans had spent the first year of Korean deployment in Vietnam assuming that effective counterinsurgency looked like what Americans were doing, that the baseline of capability was American capability, and Allied forces were to be measured against it. By 1967, the reverse had become quietly and unofficially true. American commanders studying Korean operations were looking at those operations as reference points, as examples of what good performance could look like when force structure and doctrine were aligned with operational reality. The Korean approach to pacification in their tactical area was not identical to the Australian approach being pursued simultaneously in Quang Ngai Province, but it shared the same foundational insight. Force multiplied by intelligence is more effective than force multiplied by firepower. Patient, persistent presence in a specific area creates a security environment that temporary, massive operations cannot replicate. You cannot pacify a province from a helicopter. You cannot achieve population security by cycling through an area with enough troops to drive the enemy temporarily underground and then departing, leaving behind nothing but the memory of noise. The enemy returns. The enemy always returns, unless you give them a reason not to. The Koreans gave the enemy in Quang Ngai Province a reason. The reason was the accumulating cost, battle by battle, ambush by ambush, cache seizure by cache seizure of operating in an area where the Blue Dragons were. The American body count metric, the single most argued over measurement in the entire historiography of the Vietnam War, was nearly useless as a way of understanding what Korean forces were accomplishing. American generals measured success in enemy killed per day, per operation, per month. By that metric, Korean operations sometimes appeared modest. They did not seek contact the way American units did. They did not generate the firefights that generated the body count. What they generated instead was weapons, prisoners, intelligence, and, most importantly, most unmeasurably, the systematic degradation of enemy confidence in their own ability to operate freely. When Viet Cong forces in a Korean tactical area of responsibility could not move weapons, could not hold training camps, could not hold meetings, because Korean intelligence had too thorough a picture of the ground and Korean ambushes were too consistently positioned on the likely routes, the body count in that area did not necessarily spike, it declined. It declined because the enemy was no longer there to be counted. The Korean area of operations was, by the assessment of American commanders themselves, consistently the safest tactical area of responsibility in the region. The battle at Tra Bin Dong was the public proof of what the Blue Dragons could do in the harshest possible circumstances, but it was also, in some ways, the least representative thing about their service. The battle was spectacular because the odds were spectacular. What was genuinely remarkable about the Korean Marine performance in Vietnam was not the single cataclysmic engagement, but the grinding, daily, patient operational tempo that produced a cumulative result measurable in the security and stability of a province over years, not hours. The battle proved they could survive being attacked by a regiment. The years proved they could make a regiment afraid to attack. After Tra Bin Dong, American commanders' recognition of Korean effectiveness hardened from skepticism to something approaching reliance. American senior officers increasingly placed Korean units in difficult operational environments with demanding missions, precisely because they had come to trust the Korean calculus that whatever the Blue Dragons and the Capital Division were assigned, they would approach it with the same thoroughness, the same preparation, the same patience that had produced the weapon seizures and the intelligence picture and, at its most concentrated, the hill at Tra Bin Dong. The 2nd Marine Brigade conducted continued operations through 1967 and 1968 and beyond, including Operation Dragonfire on the Batangan Peninsula in the autumn of 1967, which produced 412 enemy killed at a cost of 46 Koreans in nearly 2 months of sustained operations. The brigade found ways to fight in every kind of terrain the central Vietnamese coast produced. Over the full course of the Korean military commitment to Vietnam, which would eventually encompass more than 312,000 total Korean personnel rotating through the theater, the Blue Dragon Brigade and the Capital Division together demonstrated an operational consistency that the American Vietnam Studies assessment captured, however inadequately, in its language about tenacity and tactical innovation. By the end, the Korean tactical areas of responsibility showed measurable improvements in security indicators that were difficult to attribute to anything other than the quality and persistence of Korean operations. Enemy-initiated incidents declined, weapons caches were found and exploited at rates that other Allied forces could not match. Road security improved in ways that mattered to provincial populations trying to move food and goods and live something resembling a normal life under the pressure of a war that had been going on for decades before Americans ever arrived. The general who had looked at the Blue Dragon commanders in that briefing room and concluded that their men might not be up to the task had made a mistake that was, in the context of American military culture in 1966, almost predictable. He had assessed an Allied force by the appearance of its equipment, the height of its soldiers, the foreignness of its language, and the superficial differences in its methods. He had not assessed it by the thing that actually determines the quality of a military force, which is what those soldiers are capable of doing when they are placed in the hardest possible circumstances and told to hold. He found out what they were capable of on February 15, 1967, when the reports came in from Tra Bin Dong, and whatever private revision of professional opinion followed that reading, it did not become part of the public record. But the battle is part of the public record. 15 Korean Marines and 246 enemy dead on a low hill north of Quang Ngai City in 4 hours before sunrise. Captain Jong Kyung-jin and his men inside a perimeter that was breached twice and taken back both times. Staff Sergeant Bei and his squad fighting with entrenching tools when the grenades were gone. Private First Class Kim killing 10 men with his rifle as they came toward him. Sergeant Lee with a grenade in each hand, waiting. Lieutenant Shin leading a fire team outside the wire and coming back. Lance Corporals Porta and Long calling airstrikes close enough to feel, and fighting alongside men whose language they didn't speak, in a battle they would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe. The official history of the Republic of Korea Marine Corps records the Battle of Tra Bin Dong as the moment the Blue Dragons became something more than a military unit. They became a legend within their own institutional culture, the reference point against which Korean military excellence would be measured. In Korean military colleges, the battle is still taught as a case study in what company-level defense looks like when preparation is thorough, leadership is sound, and soldiers are capable of exactly the kind of fighting that no manual can fully prepare them for. The fighting that happens when the perimeter is breached and the only resources left are the ones inside a man's chest. In American military writing about Vietnam, the Battle of Tra Bin Dong appears in footnotes and appendices and the supporting chapters of books about other things. It is not the center of the American narrative of that war because it is not an American story. It is a Korean story, fought on a Vietnamese hill, in a war that American institutional memory has organized around American experience. But the battle exists, and the records exist, and the assessment written by American military analysts who spent years trying to understand what the Koreans were doing and why it worked so well, that exists too. It contains, buried in its dry professional language, the ghost of a different conclusion from the one that General reached in that briefing room in 1966. The Americans who had questioned Korean capability and later studied Korean performance arrived at a judgment that carries within it the full weight of institutional correction. The Koreans, they concluded, did things that American units could not fully replicate. They smelled out weapons the enemy thought were permanently concealed. They built intelligence pictures that allowed them to be in the right place before the enemy expected them. They prepared their positions to a standard that turned a company perimeter into a killing ground. They held when holding meant fighting with their hands, and they accomplished all of this with a force 1/6 the size of American deployment in a fraction of the resources, with equipment that was measurably older and supplies that were measurably thinner. The dismissal in that briefing room was never publicly corrected. Institutional corrections of that kind rarely make it into the unclassified record. But the correction was made nonetheless, quietly, in the revised way American commanders spoke about Korean operations after February 1967, in the increasingly demanding assignments placed with Korean units as the war progressed, and in the official assessment that eventually went into the permanent American military record. These men were soldiers. The kind of soldiers, the record would eventually note, that it was fortunate to have as allies rather than opponents. The kind that 246 men found out about before the sun came up on a February morning on a hill 12 kilometers north of Quang Ngai City, and did not live to report. The hill is still there. The name of the village has changed, and the war is 50 years gone, and the province has rebuilt itself around the long and complicated aftermath of a conflict that left no part of it untouched. But the hill is still there, and somewhere in the records of the Republic of Korea Ministry of National Defense, in the after-action reports and the casualty lists and the medal citations and the promotion orders, the Battle of Tra Bin Dong is preserved in the full specificity of what it was. 294 men deciding, in the darkness before a battle they knew was coming, that the position would hold, that they would hold it, that whatever came over the wire, or through the wire, or inside the wire would find them waiting, with whatever was in their hands and whatever was left in their bodies when the grenades and the bullets were spent, until the dawn came, and the hill was still theirs. It was still theirs. It was still theirs when the sun came up. It is still theirs now.